I'm gonna tell you this the way it really feels when you're there, all right, because the stories people post online make it sound like a movie. And it isn't a movie when you're the one holding the wheel with your palms sweating into the leather. You remember that stretch of highway after the city lights thin out and the road starts swallowing sound. That's where it begins for me, always. I'm not talking about one specific night, I'm talking about a pattern. Like the road itself has a habit, and you only notice it once you've driven it enough times to trust it. We were in my car the first time I realized it. You sitting right there, quiet like you are now, letting me talk, because you know I have to say it out loud, or it'll sit in my chest and rot. The gas station up ahead looked normal from a distance. A clean little island of fluorescent light in the dark. Trucks parked wide, a couple of cars, the kind of place you'd stop without thinking twice. But as I got closer, I noticed how the light didn't spill the way it should. It was bright, yeah, but it felt contained, like the darkness around it was thicker than usual, like the night had pressed its face to the glass and refused to step back. I pulled in anyway because we needed fuel and because I didn't want to be the guy who jumps at shadows. The air smelled like wet asphalt and old grease and something sweetish underneath, like burned sugar. There was a man near the pumps who looked like he'd been standing there for a long time, not pacing, not checking a phone, just positioned in that still way that makes you feel like you walked into the middle of somebody else's scene. I nodded at him, polite, and he didn't nod back. He watched the car the way a person watches a door to see who's going to come through it. Inside the convenience store, the radio was playing something low and nostalgic, and the cashier was smiling too much in that tired way, like the smile was the last piece of uniform he hadn't lost yet. I asked for cigarettes. I don't even smoke sometimes, just to force a normal exchange. He rang me up, and I swear to you he hesitated before giving me change, like he had to remember how to do it. When I asked if the restroom key was available, he pointed without looking, like he'd pointed 1,000 times, and stopped caring whether anyone came back. I didn't go. Something about that hallway behind the shelves, that narrow, dim passage where the light got weaker, felt like the edge of a cliff. I paid, thanked him, walked back out, and that man by the pumps was gone, not walking away, not in a car, not anywhere, just removed like a prop between frames. You're quiet. I know you're thinking I'm dramatizing, but I'm not. I got back in, and for a second I couldn't remember why we were even there, like the place had wiped a line in my head clean. Then the engine turned over, and the world snapped back. As we pulled out, I saw a different figure near the far end of the lot, standing by a truck that was dark inside. No cabin light, no movement. The figure was too tall or too straight or something, and it wasn't the way you expect a person to be at rest. It was like a signpost pretending to be a man. I told myself it was the angle, the glare, the fatigue. But once we were back on the highway, I glanced in the mirror, and the station lights weren't behind us anymore. The road was empty in both directions, but the glow was gone so completely it felt impossible, like we'd driven out of a memory instead of a place. And that's when I started noticing the other things, the little wrong details that only appear when you're alone between towns, the kinds of details that make you understand why truckers sometimes talk to each other just to keep the dark from getting ideas. Você disse, ChatGPT disse. After that night, I started keeping a kind of private map in my head, not of exits and mileage, but of the places that felt like they had a second face. You know how some stops feel welcoming even when they're empty, and others feel populated even when you can't see anyone? It was like that. I'd be driving a straight black ribbon of road, and then I'd see a gas station sign blinking ahead, and my stomach would decide before my brain did whether we were stopping. That's when I began noticing the pattern with the trucks. The same kinds of trucks, same tired silhouettes and stacked trailers, but always parked a little too far from the pumps in a loose crescent, like they were making a boundary instead of resting. At one of these places I pulled in, and the lot was so quiet, I could hear the mild ticking of my engine cooling down, and as I stepped out, I realized all the truck cabs were facing outward, away from the store, away from the lights, like they wanted the fastest possible escape. I remember thinking some driver must have told a story that spread like smoke and got everyone to park that way without even talking about it. Inside the store, the shelves were perfectly neat, too neat, like a display that had never been touched by a real person. The cashier was a woman with tired eyes and a calm voice, and when I asked if the coffee was fresh, she said yes, in a way that didn't sound like a lie, but didn't sound like truth either. More like a line she'd learned to keep the place glued together. I poured a cup anyway, mostly for the warmth, and the coffee tasted thin and metallic, like the water had been pulled from somewhere deep and cold. You were in the car then. You'd offered to stay, because you could tell I didn't want to be alone in that aisle of light. But I told you it was fine, just a quick stop, and I could feel the dumb pride of being the one who always claims he isn't afraid. When I walked back out, the air had changed. The wind was there, but moving wrong, swirling in small circles, tugging at trash near the curb, as if something invisible was pacing. I saw a smoker by the side of the building, a shape leaning against the wall, the tiny orange dot of a cigarette bright in the dark. I nodded again, automatic, and the dot didn't move. No inhale, no exhale, no ember shifting. I took 2 steps closer and realized it wasn't a cigarette at all, but a little red indicator light on a metal box bolted to the wall, and the person was just a stain of shadow, shaped like a body, because the light behind it was missing a piece. Because my mind had done what minds do on lonely roads. It had tried to make a human out of the unknown, so I'd feel less isolated. That should have been funny. It wasn't. It felt like a warning that my senses were starting to get sloppy out here, and that the road was the kind of place where sloppy senses could get you swallowed. We left and drove until the station was far behind us, and then we passed another sign. The same brand, the same colors, the same promise of light and rest, and you looked at me like you'd noticed it too, like you wanted to ask why the logo was identical down to the chipped corner, and why the price board showed the same numbers. I pretended not to see it. I kept driving because I didn't want to give the night permission to repeat itself, but the sign came again after another stretch, and again after that, and each time it was the same, like we were crossing a loop laid over the highway, a thin strip of reality that someone had folded the wrong way. Eventually, I pulled off at a small turnout just to breathe, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel, watching the darkness beyond the line of our headlights. You didn't say anything, and that silence helped me more than any reassurance. Then, from somewhere out there beyond the light, I heard a voice that sounded like it was coming through a cheap speaker, calm and flat, saying the name of the station brand, like an invitation. I turned the radio off because my first thought was interference, a late-night ad, but the voice kept going, softer now, repeating the name like someone calling a pet in from the yard. I rolled the window down a crack, and the air that came in was colder than it should have been, carrying that same sweet, burnt smell I'd noticed before. And I heard a second voice far away, answering in a way that sounded like a dozen people whispering in unison. I don't know what expression I had on my face then, but you reached over and locked your door without looking at me, quiet and steady. That little click was the smartest thing either of us did. I started the engine, and we got back on the highway, and the voice stopped as if it had never been there, as if it only existed for the moment we were willing to doubt ourselves. I wish I could tell you that was the worst of it, but the truth is, the road doesn't escalate like a story. It accumulates. It adds small weights to your mind until you start feeling them even in daylight. Because after the loop of stations, after the trucks turned outward like a defensive circle, after the false smoker made of missing light, there was the night we stopped to help a car whose hazard lights were blinking on the shoulder, a tiny, pulsing beacon in the dark. I slowed and you didn't protest, but you leaned forward the way a listener leans in when he senses the part he won't like. The car was an older sedan, hood down, trunk closed, but the interior light was on. I pulled behind it and walked up expecting to find a stranded family, a tired traveler, someone grateful. The driver's door was open and the seat was empty. The interior smelled like stale perfume and hot plastic. On the dashboard was a receipt from the exact gas station brand we'd seen repeating earlier, and the total on it was so low it looked like someone had bought only a single item, a token purchase, like paying the road a small fee. Then I saw the phone in the cup holder with the screen still lit, a map app open, route line drawn straight ahead, and a message thread with one last unsent line typed and abandoned. I think the lights are copying themselves. I stepped back, heart thudding because the hazard lights were still blinking, and yet the battery should have died by then if the car had been sitting long enough to cool the air inside into that dead stillness. I called out just a simple hello into the night, and my voice sounded too loud, like shouting in a church. Nothing answered. Then the car's interior light turned off by itself. Not fading, not flickering, just off. The hazard light stopped too. And in the sudden darkness, in that breath where your eyes are useless, I heard footsteps behind me that were not yours. I didn't spin around. I walked calmly back to my car the way you walk away from something you don't want to prove real. I got in, locked the doors, and you were already facing forward, seatbelt on, like you'd decided trust was the only way to survive the moment. As we pulled away, I looked in the side mirror and saw that the sedan was no longer there. There was only grass and a low ditch and the shape of an old signpost, leaning crooked in the wind, as if it had been waiting to be mistaken for a person all along. And that was when I understood what these roads and these gas stations really are in the deep night. Not just places to pass through, but places that test the shape of your attention. Places that see how easy it is to get you to stop, to step out of your warm, moving bubble, to become a still thing in a world that prefers you still. You're quiet again, same as always, and I'm grateful for it, because I'm not telling you this to impress you or to scare you for fun. I'm telling you because we're still driving, because the next pool of light is coming up ahead, and because I need you to know why I'm going to keep going this time, even if the fuel gauge dips lower than comfort, even if the sign looks friendly, even if the night tries to offer us a clean, bright place to rest, because the last thing I want is to discover that some stations don't sell gasoline at all. They sell the moment you decide to trust them. Você diz, oh ChatGPT disse, you ever notice how the worst part isn't the moment something goes wrong, but the moment right before it, when everything tries to look ordinary enough to disarm you? That's exactly how the next place showed up. No repeating signs this time, no weird loop, just a single station near a long, quiet stretch, the kind you'd normally welcome because your eyes are heavy and the road has started to feel too wide. The lights were brighter than the others, almost clean, and there was a small diner attached to the side with a few plastic tables under a canopy. I remember thinking maybe I was being unfair to the night. Maybe I was turning coincidence into a curse because my head wanted a story. I signaled in before I could overthink it. You didn't say a word, but your posture shifted. Subtle, like your body had already voted no. I parked near the far pump where I could see the store door and the edge of the lot. The moment I stepped out, that smell returned, faint but unmistakable, that sweet burned note mixed with old fuel and damp ground. The air felt thicker there, not humid exactly, just loaded, like a room where people had been arguing and stopped the second you walked in. I told myself to be practical, quick fuel, quick restroom, back on the highway. Practical is a shield, right? Inside, the store was empty. Not even a cashier at the counter. A bell pinged when I walked in, and the sound seemed to travel too far, like the building was bigger than it looked from the outside. The aisles were stocked, the coolers were humming, the coffee machine was bubbling, but there was no human rhythm to the place. The security monitor above the counter showed grainy views of the lot, and that's the detail that still sits in my throat when I try to swallow it down. On the screen, I could see our car. I could see me walking in, but I couldn't see you. The passenger seat on the camera feed was empty, plain as day, like you weren't sitting there breathing and waiting the way I knew you were. I stared at that monitor too long. I even leaned in like a fool, trying to catch a glitch, a delay, anything that would preserve the normal. But the feed didn't flicker. It was steady and calm and wrong. I stepped away, turned my head toward the glass door, and I saw you through it, right where you'd been the whole time. I looked back up at the monitor, and the seat was still empty. I didn't call your name. I didn't wave to test it. I've learned that some things on these roads feel like traps, precisely because they invite you to prove them. I walked to the counter and said hello, louder than necessary, and from a back room, a man emerged slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. Middle-aged, heavy eyelids, a face that looked like it had seen too many tired people and decided to stop feeling surprise. I asked for a bottle of water because I needed to hear a mundane sentence come out of my mouth. He rang it up, slid it over, and his eyes flicked to the monitor as if checking the lot was a habit more than a choice. Then he looked at me and said, real casual, like he was talking about the weather, that sometimes the cameras don't like certain passengers. I froze in that controlled way you freeze when you don't want your fear to show its teeth. I asked what he meant. He shrugged and said that vehicles come through with someone riding along who doesn't show up on footage, and that people either leave quick or they decide to go behind the diner for a smoke and never get seen again. He said it without drama, like a man reciting rules for a game he didn't invent. I laughed a little because that's what you do when a stranger puts your private unease into words. He didn't laugh back. He just asked if I wanted a receipt. I said no, and walked out with my water and my pride, trying to pretend everything was fine. You were still in the seat, still real, still quiet, and I felt a surge of relief so sharp it almost turned into anger, like how dare the night make me doubt the most basic thing in front of my eyes. I started the pump, kept my gaze on the windows, and the lot looked empty except for a single truck parked near the diner, engine off, cabin dark. That truck hadn't been there when we pulled in. I would have noticed it because I'm not that blind. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had rolled in quietly while I was inside. Maybe the angle hid it. But then I noticed something else. A narrow trail of wet footprints leading from the diner's back door toward the truck. Deep prints that looked heavier than one person, as if someone had been dragged or had walked with a weight that wasn't fully their own. The footprints stopped at the passenger side door, not the driver's side. Passenger. I looked at you instinctively, and you were staring straight ahead like you could feel my eyes, and you didn't want to meet them. That silence between us wasn't fear exactly. It was agreement. We both understood that the wrongest things are often quiet invitations. I finished fueling faster than I've ever fueled in my life, got in, and the moment the doors shut, the cabin felt safer, like a sealed bubble in toxic air. I turned the key and the engine hesitated, just a brief reluctance but enough to make my pulse jump. The dashboard lights flickered once, and for that heartbeat, the radio turned on by itself to a low, static voice. A man was speaking softly, not a broadcast voice, not a clean signal, but a close voice, like someone sitting in our back seat, leaning forward to talk between us. He wasn't saying words I could understand, just that rhythm of speech that implies meaning, like a lullaby in a language you almost recognize. I snapped the radio off. The engine caught. We rolled forward, and I looked in the mirror out of habit. The truck was still there, the footprints were still there, but now there was a person sitting in the passenger seat of the truck, perfectly still, facing forward, illuminated by nothing at all, like a silhouette cut from the darkness itself. I wanted to believe it was just a driver waiting for someone, but the passenger door was open, and there was nobody standing outside of it. The seat's outline was there, occupied by a shape that looked too tall for the space, too thin, too composed, the kind of presence that doesn't fidget because it doesn't need to breathe. I didn't stop to watch. I didn't slow to process. I drove out and kept the speed steady, not too fast to look panicked, not too slow to look willing. The station lights shrank behind us. This time they didn't vanish abruptly, they just receded like normal. And that almost made it worse, because it meant the night could choose when to be blatant and when to behave. After a while, you shifted and finally let out a breath I hadn't realized you were holding. You still didn't say anything, and I respected that. I think once you start speaking about these things on the road, you risk giving them names, and names are a kind of door. So I kept talking instead, filling the car with my voice, tethering us to the simple human act of one friend unloading his fear, while the other offers the quiet gift of presence. I told you I was done stopping at isolated stations. I told you I'd rather run the tank low than pay whatever hidden cost those lights were asking for, and I meant it. But the road has a cruel sense of timing, because not long after that promise, we saw a small flare of headlights ahead and a slow-moving vehicle wobbling near the shoulder. A delivery van, maybe, struggling. My foot lifted instinctively, the old reflex to help, to be decent, to be a man who doesn't leave strangers in the dark. And then you did something you'd never done before. You reached out and placed your hand lightly on my forearm, not gripping, not pleading, just a calm weight, a reminder that we already knew too much about what the night likes to pretend to be. I nodded once, more to myself than to you, and I kept driving. The van faded behind us. My conscience fought me for a while, but then I saw the reflection of its lights on a distant sign ahead, and the glow spelled out that same station brand again, the same colors, the same promise. And I realized the van had never needed help. It had been bait with wheels. So yeah, that's where I am with it now. I'm not saying every highway stop is cursed. I'm not saying every late-night cashier knows more than they should. I'm saying there's a thin layer of normal that sits over certain places, and when you drive long enough, you start noticing the seams. You start noticing which lights feel like refuge and which feel like lures. And you start understanding why some people, when they tell these stories, always mention how they weren't alone in the car, even if only one of them ever speaks. Because the listener matters. The silence matters. It's proof that the world still contains something human and steady, something that doesn't need to argue with the darkness to refuse it. We're still moving. The road is still open in front of us. And if another island of light shows up out here with that too clean glow and that sweet burned smell, I'm not stopping. I'm not even looking long enough for my mind to try turning shadows into people again. I'm just going to keep talking to you, keep the engine alive, keep the night on the outside where it belongs, because I've learned the hard way that some places on the road don't want your money, they want your attention, and once you give them that, they start negotiating for the rest. Você disse, ChatGPT disse, I'm glad you touched my arm back there because that tiny gesture snapped something into place for me, like a seatbelt click for the mind. After that, I started paying attention to the quieter signals, not the dramatic stuff that makes a good story, but the small behaviors people develop when they've survived enough nights to become practical about fear. Like the way some drivers won't park under the brightest light, but instead choose the edge where the darkness can't sneak up behind the glare. Like the way the old road guys never walk straight to the restroom without first glancing at the windows to check if their reflection looks normal. And yeah, I know how that sounds, but you've seen it too, that quick self-check in the glass. Like the way certain attendants keep a little bell or a radio on even when the customer flow is dead. Like a living noise is a fence. I used to think all of that was superstition. Now I think it's a language. We kept driving, and the highway started doing that thing where it feels like it's the only road left on earth. No side streets, no houses, no stray headlights, just the black ahead and the black behind. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own swallowing, your own breathing, your own thoughts trying to grow teeth. I talked anyway because talking is a way of keeping your shape. I told you about another stop from a different trip, one I didn't mention before because I wanted to believe it was a one-off. That one had a small attached wash bay, a place where truckers could rinse the grime off their rigs. The lot was busy enough to feel safe, and the lights were warm, a softer yellow that didn't stab your eyes. But there was a line of cones blocking the wash entrance, with a handwritten sign taped to a pole, something simple like out of service. What bothered me wasn't the cones, it was the fact that they'd been arranged like a barrier to a crime scene rather than a maintenance issue, and everyone was respecting it in a way that felt rehearsed. A guy in a stained jacket was vending snacks out of a cooler by the pumps, joking with drivers, laughing too loud, and every time his eyes flicked toward that blocked wash bay, the laughter would cut for half a second like a record skipping. I bought a bottle of water there too, a pointless ritual by now, and asked the attendant if the wash was broken. He said yes, but his mouth said it too fast. Then he lowered his voice and said that the last truck that went in didn't come out the same way it went in. I asked what that meant, because sometimes the simplest question is a test of whether the other person is sane. He didn't answer with a story. He answered with a gesture, a quick tilt of the chin toward the shadowed doorway, like he was telling me not to make him say it. I walked closer, and from the entrance I could smell bleach and wet metal, and something sharp, like pennies. Inside the wash bay, the floor was soaked and glistening under a single overhead light, and the water was running even though nobody was working, just streaming down the walls in thin threads, as if the place was sweating. The worst detail was the voice. A low mutter from somewhere deeper inside, not loud enough to be words, but steady, patient, like someone talking to a friend who isn't answering. I backed away slowly. I didn't run. I've learned that a lot of these places seem to respond to panic, like a dog responding to motion. The attendant watched me retreat and nodded as if I had passed a test. I didn't tell you that story then because I didn't want to turn our drive into a museum of dread. But tonight it felt relevant because the road keeps trying to sell you the idea that danger is always sudden and obvious. And it isn't. Sometimes it's institutional. Sometimes it's a place with a manager and a cleaning schedule and a coffee machine that still works, while something wrong quietly occupies a corner that everyone has decided to ignore. That's what made these highway stations feel so sinister to me. Not that they were haunted in some cinematic way, but that they were functional in spite of whatever lived alongside the function. We passed a rest area sign and I ignored it. The fuel gauge dipped lower than I liked, and I ignored that too. The car began making that subtle, hungry sound engines make when you're asking them to stretch a little farther than comfort, and I lifted my foot just enough to be gentle. You shifted in your seat again, and I knew you were watching the same math I was watching. Distance versus fuel versus the risk of the next island of light. That's the thing people don't talk about when they tell these stories. How fear becomes logistics. How bravery becomes an ugly practical decision. How sometimes the smartest move is the one that makes you look like a coward to a stranger. A while later, we came up behind a convoy of 2 trucks and a smaller car, tucked between them like a child walking between bigger siblings. The trucks kept steady speed, and the little car looked more relaxed inside that moving pocket of protected light. I remember thinking that's a good strategy. That's how you borrow safety without stopping. We slid in behind them at a respectful distance, and for a few miles the road felt less lonely. The radio stayed off. The only sound was tires and wind and my voice. Then the lead truck's brake lights flared gently, not a hard stop, just a caution rhythm, and the whole line slowed. Ahead, another gas station, different brand this time, different logo. I felt that wash of relief because my brain wanted variety to equal safety. The little car between the trucks signaled and turned in. The rear truck followed, the lead truck followed. It looked like a coordinated decision, like they all knew each other. I almost did it too, almost let the social proof override my instincts, but then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. As the little car turned, its headlights swept across the station lot, and for a split second the light revealed that the asphalt was marked with faint lines, old tire tracks that weren't just normal traffic patterns. They formed a loose spiral around the building, as if vehicles over time had been guided into a circling orbit. I know that sounds like my mind drawing shapes again, but I'm telling you what I saw. The spiral was subtle, but real, a ghost of movement baked into the ground. You didn't say anything. You didn't have to. I stayed on the highway. The convoy vanished into the light behind us. A minute later, the lead truck's headlights didn't reappear. The rear trucks didn't reappear. The little cars didn't reappear. No engines merging back onto the road. No distant beams approaching in the mirror. Just empty darkness swallowing the last signs of them. I kept driving with my jaw clenched hard enough to hurt. That was the point where the story inside my head stopped being about isolated incidents and turned into something colder, a recognition that some stops were not just traps for the unlucky or the naive, but for the social, the tired, the people who take comfort in the fact that others are doing the same thing. The road opened again, straight and quiet, and I realized my voice had gotten lower, more controlled, the way people talk when they're trying to remain the most stable thing in the room. I told you I wasn't going to be pulled into a spiral just because someone else was. I told you that whatever was out here seemed to love groups as much as loners, maybe more, because groups create momentum, and momentum creates trust. You listened the way you always do, that calm presence that makes the cabin feel less like a car and more like a lifeboat. Then we saw the first hint of dawnlight color on the horizon, not enough to call it morning, just enough to dilute the black into deep gray. The world doesn't instantly become safe when the sky changes, but it does change the rules of your imagination. I could feel the night's grip loosening in small increments, like fingers releasing after holding too long. We finally reached a bigger interchange, more traffic, more legitimate noise, and I took the first exit to a well-lit station that had a busy bakery and families inside, the kind of place where the normal is so loud it drowns out anything that can't stand daylight-adjacent attention. I fueled up there and didn't smell the burned sweetness. I didn't see trucks parked outward like defensive animals. The camera feed showed you right where you were supposed to be. The coffee tasted like coffee, and I felt something close to embarrassment for how tightly I'd been holding myself together. But here's the thing I need you to take from all this, and it's why I keep talking even when I'm not sure I should, because admitting the pattern aloud might be like sketching the outline of a creature you don't want to invite into focus. The highway at night isn't one place. It's a string of worlds stitched together by your headlights. Most of them are harmless. Some are just lonely. And a few are wrong, in a way that doesn't announce itself with screams or apparitions. They announce themselves with repetition, with missing reflections, with stations that feel too clean, with convoys that don't come back out, with attendants who speak like they're making peace with something they can't defeat. You don't have to believe in ghosts to respect that. You just have to believe that certain places collect stories the way low ground collects water, and once enough stories pool, the place starts behaving like it remembers. So if we ever do this drive again, and we will, because life has a way of making you cross the same dark miles in different seasons of your own exhaustion, I want you to keep doing what you did tonight. Keep listening. Keep being that quiet anchor. Because as long as I'm talking to someone real beside me, as long as the car stays moving, as long as we don't let the night negotiate us into stopping where it wants us still, I think we'll be okay. I don't think the darkness wins by force out here. I think it wins by getting you to agree to small, reasonable choices that lead you gently into a place where the lights are bright, the coffee is on, the doors are open, and the road behind you gets just a little harder to find. Você diz? Oh, ChatGPT dis. There's one more piece I've never told you, and I think I've been circling it all night without really meaning to, like those tire marks around that station, like part of me hoped if I kept orbiting, I'd never have to go into the center, but you're still here, still listening, and the road has given us enough miles that it almost feels wrong to keep it to myself any longer. So I'm just gonna say it straight. This isn't the first time I've done this drive with someone sitting in that seat beside me, quiet, steady, letting me talk my way through the dark. Back then it was another friend, not you, a guy I'd known for years, the kind of friend you don't overthink because he's just woven into your routines, the guy you message when your plans fall through because you know he won't mind being the backup option. And somehow that makes him the most reliable one. We were doing almost this exact route, heading out of the city into that same heavy nowhere, and the pattern with the stations was just starting to nibble at the edge of my awareness. I remember we stopped at one of those bigger highway plazas, the kind with a fast food chain bolted to the side and a playground nobody uses after dark, and everything looked normal enough except for one detail. The cashier kept asking if it was just me or you two. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times in slightly different ways, like he was trying to get the answer to line up with what he thought he saw. You paying just for yourself? You guys together on one receipt or separate? So one meal now? Or your friend wants something too? It was weird because my friend hadn't come inside with me. He said he'd stay in the car, too tired to move, and I had even joked, "Fine, be a corpse, I'll bring snacks back to the body." So I told the cashier it was just me, and every time he repeated the question, there was this tiny crease forming between his eyebrows, like he was trying to be polite, but something wasn't reconciling. When I went back outside, my buddy was in the passenger seat, half turned toward the window, lit by the parking lot lamps, looking so solid and ordinary that the weirdness almost washed right off me. I tossed him his drink. He caught it without looking. We drove on. The night after that was when the stranger things started to show up. The loops, the empty cars, the noises that sounded like distant ads calling to nobody. I chalked it up to fatigue and coincidence. You know how I am. I'm stubborn about my reality. But a few weeks later, after that trip was over, I happened to be back at that same plaza in the daytime. Bright sun, kids actually on the playground, everything loud and harmless. I stopped for coffee and recognized the same cashier, or maybe shift manager. His badge said something different that day. I don't remember. What I do remember is that he recognized me instantly and said, "Hey, it's you. You came through late that one night, right? You were with someone then, yeah?" And I said yes, and I said my friend's name, and I said it like an anchor, like naming him pinned the memory down in one clear piece. The guy nodded, relieved, like he'd been worried he'd misread something important. Then he said, "I had to review the cameras that morning because of some inventory thing," and he hesitated like he wasn't sure if he should keep going, but his curiosity beat his caution. "And you were the only one I saw on any of the footage. Coming in, going out, walking across the lot, getting into the car, driving away. That's why I kept asking. I swore there were 2 of you." And I laughed it off in his face, said it was probably some glitch, one angle missed, compressed file, whatever excuse tech gives us, so we don't have to ask the old questions in new language. He accepted that answer because it made his world tidier, and I walked back to my car with my coffee and a knot forming at the base of my skull. I didn't mention it to my friend right away. You don't lead with, "Hey, cameras refuse to admit you exist, you know." But when I looked up from the steering wheel, from the plastic cup in my hand, there was this flicker of something in the glass reflection of the windshield just for a second, like I could see myself clearly, and the spot where he should have been was slightly delayed, a half beat out of sync with the rest of reality. And that's when little details from that night started replaying in my head. How the automatic doors only opened the exact width of my own body, even when he walked close beside me. How the motion sensor faucets in the restroom reacted only when I moved, but stayed still when he did. How the sliding cooler doors never fogged where he breathed near the glass. Tiny things, stupid things, the kind of details you don't collect until you feel like something bigger is interrogating your memory. I tested it once after that. Not in a science way, just in a quiet, personal experiment. We were at a different station, more crowded, more noise, and I pretended to tie my shoe near the corner where the security monitor hung overhead. I told him to wait for me at the coffee stand, and then I watched the screen, watched the doorway where we'd just come in. I saw myself, clear, solid, moving around like a guy who knows where the sugar packets are kept. I saw other customers too, truckers, a couple arguing softly near the lottery tickets, a kid trying to reach a candy bar on the wrong shelf. What I didn't see at all was him. Not as a blur, not as a distortion, not even as an absence that made the crowd bend around him. It was like the cameras were painting the world without that color. When I finally told him, I framed it as a joke, something like, "Hey, did you know you're a vampire in digital form?" And I expected him to roll his eyes and call me an idiot, but he just went very quiet and said he hadn't shown up in his home security footage for months either, that he thought it was some issue with his system, some bug he'd never gotten around to fixing. He said it like he already knew on some level and had been waiting for an external confirmation to decide whether to worry. He laughed too, but it was that thin laughter that sits on top of something much heavier. We didn't talk about it again, at least not directly. He still rode with me at night sometimes, still sat in that seat, still listened while I drove and filled the dark with words. Then one night, after a particularly strange run on a different highway, one with a rest stop that seemed to rearrange its own layout between arrival and departure, like some shelves had moved closer, some tables had shifted, the restroom door hinging the opposite way. We had an argument about something small and real and human, nothing to do with ghosts or cameras or stations. It was about being late, about a favor I hadn't returned, about money I owed him and hadn't mentioned. We snapped at each other in that ugly, honest way friends do when they're more tired than polite. I dropped him off near his place, watched him walk down the sidewalk to his building, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched, completely ordinary under the streetlights. I drove home, slept badly, told myself I'd apologize tomorrow. The next day came and went, and I didn't call. Stubbornness is one of the dumbest forms of self-defense. The day after that, I finally swallowed my pride enough to send a message, just a simple, "Hey, about last night" text. It never delivered. Then I tried calling, straight to voicemail. I figured he'd blocked me or turned his phone off to make a point. It stung, but it also felt deserved. It wasn't until a week later, when another friend casually mentioned he hadn't seen him online in any group chat for days, that cold, familiar feeling slid into my gut. I went by his place. Same building. Same door. No answer. Neighbor said he thought the guy upstairs had moved out suddenly because he hadn't heard footsteps or music. No lights at odd hours. Nothing. But the landlord, when I pushed a little, said nobody had turned in keys. Nobody had cancelled a lease. It was like he'd just stopped needing to open doors. I know how this sounds. People vanish from their social circles all the time for normal reasons, bad jobs, new relationships, mental health spirals, all the real-world monsters that eat up presence. I clung to those explanations so hard that my knuckles whitened around them. But at night, on roads like this, when I pass certain stations and catch a glimpse of the monitors through the glass, or see the way trucks form those protective circles, I can't help wondering whether some passengers become more fluent in the darkness than in the daylight, whether some people gradually slip into the part of the highway the cameras refuse to translate. And when I'm driving with you like tonight, and I look over and see you just as solid and real as you've always been, there's this weird double feeling, comfort and dread layered together. Comfort because you're here, breathing, listening, shifting in your seat when the car hits a bump. Dread because the road has already shown me it can edit reality depending on who's looking, and I can't always be sure which version it's editing for. That's why I keep talking, I think. Not just to keep myself sane, but to pin you to the same version of the story I'm in. As long as I'm telling you what I see, as long as we agree on the shape of the gas station, the angle of the truck, the smell of the air, then whatever is out there has to work harder to rewrite us. It can blur the cameras, it can loop the signs, it can rearrange the footprint of a diner in the time it takes to fill a tank, but it can't easily break the shared story between two people in a moving car. That's my theory anyway. That's what I hang on to when the fuel gets low and the next patch of light on the horizon looks a little too bright, a little too polished, like a smile with too many teeth. Você diz, oh ChatGPT dis, and that's the cruelest part, isn't it? How the road doesn't have to invent a monster when it can just make you question the category a person belongs to. Because once you've had that thought even once, every late-night stop becomes a little test you didn't agree to take. You start noticing who gets acknowledged by the little automatic systems of the world and who doesn't. You start tasting the air for that burnt sweetness like it's a chemical warning label. You start watching the way strangers look at you when you walk in alone and still order for two without thinking. You start feeling guilty for being the one that reality kept, as if the universe had made a choice you never submitted paperwork for. We stayed on the highway, the sky getting lighter by degrees that felt almost merciful, and I remember thinking maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe the day would wash the night out of our clothes. But the next stretch proved something I hate admitting. Sometimes the morning doesn't erase the weirdness, it just changes its posture. It becomes quieter, more polite. The kind of wrong that doesn't jump out to scare you, but slides its hand into your pocket and walks away with something you won't miss until you're miles past the last exit. We stopped at a larger service area later, not because I trusted it, but because life is stubborn and bodies need the basics. This place had that busy, ordinary energy I told you about before. Families, a line for pastries, a little gift rack full of cheap keychains that say the name of the region. I chose it because the normal was loud enough to be a shield, and for a while it worked. The smell was just fresh bread and disinfectant. The chatter was human. The cashier made a joke about my tired face, and I laughed like a normal person. But then I noticed the map board on the wall near the entrance, one of those big tourist boards showing local routes with cute icons and simplified lines. Someone had added marker scribbles to it. At first I thought it was a kid drawing a dragon or a bored traveler leaving a signature, but the scribbles weren't random. They were circles around certain gas stations, each circle thicker than the last, like someone had returned multiple times to make sure the point was impossible to miss. Underneath, in small, cramped handwriting, were words that didn't sound like a warning so much as a rule. Don't stop if the lot is too clean. Don't stop if the trucks face outward. Don't stop if the coffee smells sweet before you pour it. Don't stop if the price board repeats even when the brand changes. The last line was the one that made my throat tighten. Don't trust the place that recognizes you before you arrive. I stood there too long, reading and pretending I was just another guy killing time. I felt stupid and relieved at the same time, because seeing your private fear written by a stranger is like hearing your name called in a crowded room. It means you're not crazy. It also means you're not safe. When I turned away from the map, I saw a man standing near the vending machines who looked like he had been waiting for me to finish reading. Not in an aggressive way. More like he'd recognized that look people get when their curiosity bumps into a bruise. He was older. Not old, but road-aged, the kind of face that has learned to sleep in short bursts and keep one eye open even in bright rooms. He nodded once and asked if I was heading back toward the city or deeper out. I said we were just passing through. He glanced past me toward the glass doors and asked who I was traveling with. I said, a friend. He didn't ask to meet you, didn't ask your name. He just said quietly that there are stretches where it helps to have a listener, because some things on the road don't like a single voice. He said that like it was a household fact, like telling someone to carry a spare tire. Then he tapped the side of his nose like a silly gesture that somehow didn't feel silly at all, and he walked away. I carried that line with me back to the car. Some things don't like a single voice. The idea is so simple. It makes you want to dismiss it. But it fits too neatly with everything I've seen. The looping places, the way certain stations feel like they want you isolated in the glow of their lights, the way missing footage seems to shadow the people whose edges are already starting to blur. If the night can't rewrite two people who are synchronized in the same story, then maybe its first move is always to separate the narrative, to get one of you inside and one of you outside, one of you looking at screens and one of you becoming the kind of person screens can't hold. That thought made me do something I don't usually do. I went back into the store and bought 2 coffees. I don't care that you didn't ask. I needed to enact the reality I wanted. I needed the cashier to see me carry 2 cups. I needed the cameras to record me leaving with 2 cups. I needed the universe to hear me say, without saying it, that this seat next to me was occupied in every way that matters. When I got back into the car and handed you one, you took it without comment, like you understood the ritual, like you understood that sometimes the most powerful protection isn't a prayer or a weapon, but a mundane act done with stubborn intention. We drove on, and for a good stretch the road behaved. The signs were unique, the exits matched the map. The lighting changed naturally with the sky. I started to relax my shoulders. That's when the message popped up on my phone, docked to the dash. No number, no contact name, just a plain text alert like a system notification. Safe stop ahead, familiar faces, hot coffee. I stared at it and felt my skin go cold. I hadn't opened any apps. I hadn't asked for navigation. The phrasing was wrong for a real alert, too intimate, like someone whispering a promise in a language of convenience. I deleted it. Another came a few miles later with slightly different wording. We remember you. That one I didn't delete. I just turned the phone face down like you do with a spider you don't want to smash because you're afraid of what will spill out. Then, because the road loves a joke that makes you feel small, we saw a station ahead that looked almost perfect. Busy enough, clean enough, nothing obviously wrong. A different brand than the one that had looped earlier, a large lot with sunlight still lingering in the air. And for a split second I wanted to believe the message was just a coincidence, a glitch, my own paranoia feeding on itself. But when we got closer, I saw the price board. The numbers were the same as the repeating signs from the night, the exact same layout of digits. It wasn't just the price, it was the spacing. The little flicker in the top corner of the digital panel that looked like a missing pixel, I recognized the way you recognize a crack in your own phone screen. I kept driving. A truck behind us honked once, annoyed. A normal human reaction to a car that didn't pull into a stop that looked convenient. I let him pass. He signaled and turned in. I watched his trailer slide into the lot. I watched the sunlight flash against the metal. I watched the last normal, boring details of a working life folding into that place. We stayed on the highway. A mile later, I glanced in the mirror and the truck's lights were no longer visible. Not because of distance, not because of a curve. The road behind us was straight. It was just gone from the story, the way the sedan had been gone, the way those earlier convoys had been gone, like the highway had quietly swallowed the punctuation mark of another person's day. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the rule I think we've stumbled into, the one that matters more than any spooky detail. The night isn't the only threat. The pattern is. The pattern doesn't care what color the sky is. It doesn't care whether you call it supernatural or psychological or just the weird math of fatigue and coincidence. It only cares whether it can get you to step out of motion into stillness, out of shared reality into a solitary one. So as long as we keep doing what we're doing right now, as long as you keep listening and I keep talking and the car keeps moving, I think we're staying on the correct side of whatever line those marker circles on the map were trying to draw. And yeah, maybe that's all this is, a story people tell themselves to stay awake and feel in control. But if that's true, then it's a story that works. Because I can feel the next patch of light ahead already, and for the first time in a while, I'm not tempted by it. I'm not hungry for the relief it offers. I'm just measuring it calmly and letting it pass. The road can keep its bright islands. We'll take the long, dark water between them. Você disse, eu sei. Oh, ChatGPT dis. We kept rolling past it like you said nothing, and like that meant everything. And I don't know if you realize how much power there is in that kind of silence, the kind that doesn't argue with fear, but simply refuses to negotiate with it. The highway widened slightly, and the landscape started to look less like wilderness and more like the outskirts of somewhere that still belongs to people. And I felt that tiny loosening inside my chest that comes when your brain senses witnesses returning to the world. But even with that, the pattern stayed close, like a shadow you can't fully shake just because the light improves. I started watching the small stuff again, not because I wanted proof, but because attention is the only thing the road hasn't managed to take from me. The billboards looked normal, but one of them had a blank panel where an ad should have been, a clean rectangle of nothing that caught my eye in a way that made my skin itch. A few miles later, another blank panel. Not the same company, not the same style of frame. Just the same naked absence facing the road, like a quiet sign that someone had peeled reality off and left the backing paper. And then I noticed the way the cars around us behaved when those blank billboards appeared. Two different drivers in two different vehicles slowed down, almost imperceptibly, then sped up after passing like they'd just crossed a line they didn't want to linger on. It wasn't panic. It was instinct. That's what scared me. When instinct spreads across strangers, it means the rule has been learned enough times to become muscle. At the next interchange, we moved into the right lane, not to exit, just to let a lane of faster traffic go by, and as we did, I caught sight of a small roadside shrine set back among the grass, one of those simple memorials people build with a cross and faded flowers, and a picture that the sun has already begun to blur. That's normal on highways. It's almost part of the scenery. But this one had something else, a little metal plaque beside the cross, and the letters on it were stamped in the same font used on the familiar station brand signage, the same clean corporate typography that never belongs on something so human. The name of a person was there, I think, but the glare made it hard to read. What I could read was the phrase underneath, short and chillingly polite, like a company policy turned into a eulogy. Exit not confirmed. I didn't say that out loud. I just kept talking around it, the way you keep driving around potholes you don't want to hit with the front wheel. I told you that maybe we were just seeing echoes of the same fear in different formats, that people out here had found a way to mark the territory without causing a stampede. Maybe a shrine wasn't just grief anymore. Maybe it was signage for the living. But even as I said it, I wasn't fully buying my own attempt at calm. Because the more the morning colored the world, the more the wrongness seemed to adapt and become subtler, like it didn't want to waste its energy on theatrics anymore. It didn't need to. We hit a stretch where the road ran close to a service lane with small businesses, repair shops, a warehouse with a sleepy security gate, the kind of area where you expect to see men in reflective vests and delivery vans and ordinary noise. And there were people. That's the part that's supposed to be comforting, but every person we passed was standing still, not leaning, not walking, not loading anything, just standing in place near open doors and parked vehicles, as if someone had told them to freeze at the exact moment the sun rose a little brighter. Their faces weren't turned toward us. They weren't turned toward anything. They were positioned like mannequins set out to convince you the world is operating. When the last one slipped behind our rear window, you shifted again, that tiny movement of a listener who can't pretend not to see it anymore. I felt a wave of gratitude that you didn't break your silence. If you had said, "Do you see that?" I might have answered with a truth I didn't want to materialize. Your quiet kept it in the realm of observation instead of declaration. A few miles after that, the lane markings changed. Fresh paint, bright, crisp, almost too perfect. My first thought was roadwork. My second thought was that the pattern loves anything that looks like a reasonable explanation. The new lines subtly funneled traffic toward an upcoming exit, not aggressively, just a gentle suggestion, the way a river guides you without asking. The exit sign didn't list a town name. It just said, services, no logo, no brand, no icons, nothing but that single word with an arrow that looked like it had been cut from older signage and recycled into a new meaning. Cars started taking it, not all at once. One here, one there, then a small cluster as if people were watching each other for permission. I wasn't going to take it, but the fuel gauge dipped again. Low enough that the practical part of my brain began whispering its ugly math. I could feel the tension of the decision building between my ribs. This is how it works, I thought. This is how the pattern makes itself look like necessity. It waits until you're tired enough, low enough, normal enough to justify the stop without admitting fear had anything to do with it. I tightened my grip on the wheel and kept my lane. The next proper city-branded station was still far enough to be uncomfortable. That's when you did it again. You reached over, not dramatic, not rushed, and you put your hand on my forearm with that same calm weight. Not a command, a reminder. I breathed out slowly and nodded. I reduced speed a little, not to crawl, but to conserve, to buy distance with patience instead of panic. It felt like choosing reason over hunger. We passed the services exit. We passed the gentle funnel of new lines. We passed the last car that seemed hesitant before committing to it, and then something happened that made my mouth go dry. The road behind us, in the mirror, didn't show the exit ramp anymore. It wasn't a trick of perspective. The interchange should have been visible for longer. Instead, there was only continuous highway, as if the exit had never existed, as if the paint had never been fresh, as if the arrow had never pointed anywhere. That kind of erasure is what makes you understand that you're dealing with something that doesn't merely mislead you. It edits, it revises. I kept my eyes forward, I kept talking. I said that whatever this thing is, it's not a demon with a face or a ghost with a script. It's a system. It's a hunger that learned how to wear infrastructure. It learned how to look like a safe, logical choice. It learned how to wait until the most reasonable version of you decides to stop. And maybe that's why the old road guys carry noise and companionship and small rituals like armor, because you can't outmuscle a system, but you can refuse its terms. The good news, if you can call it that, is that the world eventually started to return to its louder self. We reached heavier traffic. We saw a bus with passengers visible through the windows, heads tilted in that sleepy human way. We passed a legitimate police patrol parked under an overpass with an officer actually moving, actually pacing, and I felt a thin thread of relief wrap around my spine. The fuel needle sat low, stubborn, but no longer terrifying. And up ahead, finally, a dense commercial strip with real brands, daylight activity, people walking with purpose. The kind of place where cameras don't get to be picky about who exists because there are too many eyes alive at once. We still didn't stop. Not yet, because I want to get you somewhere truly crowded before we step out of this moving bubble. I want the kind of place where if the pattern tries to whisper safe stop ahead, 100 ordinary sounds will drown it out. I want a station that doesn't need to lure anyone because it's just a station, boring and bright and annoyed with the world. And when we find that, we'll fuel up, drink coffee that tastes like coffee, and we'll walk back to the car with 2 cups in our hands. Not because we're scared anymore, but because we've earned the habit of insisting on our shared version of reality. Until then, I'm staying on the highway. I'm staying in motion. And I'm staying with your silence beside me, because if the road has taught me anything worth keeping, it's that a single voice can be bait, but 2 people inside the same story, even if only one of them speaks, can be the one thing the night never quite figures out how to erase. I know that last line sounded like I was trying to turn this into some neat rule you can carry, like a charm, but that's not what I mean, not really, because the road isn't impressed by theory, it's impressed by routine, by the habits you keep even when you're exhausted and your judgment is thin. So I kept talking as we pushed deeper into the daylight-leaning traffic, and I focused on the boring details on purpose, the kind of details that make your brain feel anchored in a world that runs on ordinary cause and effect. The smell of your coffee filling the cabin, the soft squeak of the steering wheel when I adjusted my grip, the faint rattle of something in the glove compartment I kept meaning to fix. Little anchors, little proofs. Because if the pattern is a system, then your best defense isn't panic, it's consistent reality. We finally reached a big, loud, unromantic station attached to a supermarket-sized convenience hall. The kind with too many customers to curate, too many cameras to pretend they're selective, and I pulled in not because I trusted it completely, but because it felt like the first place that wasn't trying to be a story about itself. We parked among a mess of cars in different angles, the chaos of normal life, and when I stepped out, the air smelled like fried dough and cleaning products and sun-warmed asphalt. No sweet burn underneath, no metallic edge. The lot was noisy enough that even if something wanted to whisper, it would have to compete with people shouting directions to kids, and engines idling and delivery trucks backing up with that annoying beep. I went inside with you this time, not because I was worried you'd vanish from some feed, but because after everything we'd seen, walking in together felt like a statement. The cashier was a bored teenager with a lanyard and zero interest in existential mysteries, and that was beautiful. You grabbed snacks, I grabbed coffee, we paid, we left. No hesitation, no double-check questions, no space in the exchange for anything weird to wedge itself into. Back in the car, I let the silence settle for a moment, the good kind of silence that doesn't feel like a cliff edge. And then I said the thing I'd been avoiding, because it was sitting between us like an unsent message. I said that maybe the pattern doesn't target places randomly at all. Maybe it targets transitions, the thin zones between one kind of world and another. The moment when you're leaving the bright, familiar grid of a city and entering the long, quiet stretch where your mind has too much room. The moment when you're halfway between fatigue and alertness. The moment when you're just low enough on fuel to be practical, but not desperate enough to admit you're scared. It felt like the pattern lived in those seams, and the stations and the signs were just the shapes it used to make the seam visible. You took a sip of coffee like you were tasting that idea instead of the drink, and I didn't push you for a reaction, because I don't need you to agree out loud. You're not the kind of friend who hands out reassurance like cheap candy. You're the kind who proves loyalty by staying in the seat when the story gets ugly. We merged back onto the highway with a full tank and a slightly steadier pulse, and for a while the drive was almost boring, which I didn't realize I'd been craving until it showed up. We passed construction equipment, regular signage, predictable exits. We saw that familiar mess of humanity that makes the world feel less like a puzzle and more like a place you can survive with common sense. But then, because the road never fully lets you forget, I saw something that made me tighten my jaw again. A small sedan parked outside the flow of traffic near a service lane, not broken down, not flashing hazards, just sitting there. The driver had the door open and was leaning against the frame, smoking. Normal, except for the fact that beside him, on a short, portable table, he had laid out 3 printed sheets of paper like a roadside vendor. As we passed, I caught just enough of the top page to see it was a simple list, black text on white, with the heading in plain caps, Night Rules. I couldn't read the rest at speed, but the existence of that list hit me harder than any shadow figure ever could, because it meant what we experienced wasn't private. It meant the pattern had become common enough that people were writing survival notes like travelers in a dangerous country. It meant the road had quietly built a community of the warned. For a moment, I was tempted to stop, to roll down the window, to ask for a copy like it was a pamphlet that could explain everything and make me feel in control again. Then, I felt the weight of your silence and remembered what we'd learned. The pattern doesn't always get you by fear. Sometimes it gets you by curiosity. Sometimes the most dangerous stops are the ones you justify as research, so I kept driving. The miles peeled away, and the world settled into full day, and that should have been the end of the unease. But you know what kept nagging me quietly, almost like a splinter under the skin? The idea that the pattern wasn't just about places, but about attention. That it wasn't always trying to take people physically, but to thin them out in the story of the world, to make some of us easier to overlook until we become the kind of absence nobody can prove. That thought followed us all the way back into busier roads and familiar neighborhoods, and only when we turned onto streets I could drive with my eyes half closed did I feel the last tight knot inside me start to loosen. We didn't talk about it then. We didn't need to. You got out of the car, gave me that small nod you give when you're saying a lot without spending the words. I watched you walk to your door under normal streetlights, and I waited an extra second to be sure you made it inside, not because I thought the pattern would snatch you in broad daylight, but because after nights like these, you earn the right to be careful with the people you care about. And when I finally drove away alone, the weirdest thing happened. I felt less afraid than I expected, not because I thought the pattern was gone, but because I understood my own rule of survival now. Keep moving. Choose the crowded mundane over the isolated perfect. Don't let convenience become consent. And when the night gets heavy and the highway starts trying to sound like a voice calling your name through a speaker you never turned on, Find someone you trust to sit beside you, someone who can hold the shared shape of the world with you, even in silence. Because maybe that's the only real victory you get on roads like these. Not proving what's out there, not solving the mystery, just arriving with your reality intact, with your memories still yours, with the passenger seat still occupied by someone who is undeniably, stubbornly human. All right, this is where I stop circling it and just land the plane, because you gave me the signal, and I can feel the road itself thinning out into something that actually looks like a life again. After I dropped you off, after I watched you disappear behind a normal door with a normal lock, I drove a little longer without any plan except to let the engine and the daylight convince my body that the night was over. I didn't go straight home. I took the longer way through the outskirts, past the industrial lanes and the service roads where the trucks sleep in daylight like exhausted animals. I needed to prove to myself that the world was still the world when I wasn't performing courage for anyone else. That's when I saw the second list. I didn't mean to find it. I wasn't hunting. It was taped to the side of a vending machine outside a small daytime fuel stop, half covered by an offer sticker and sun-faded in places where the tape had started to peel. It was the same heading in plain caps, night rules, and beneath it a set of short lines written in that blunt, practical way that tells you the writer wasn't trying to be poetic, just trying to survive long enough to write again. Don't stop where the lot is pristine, but the air smells old. Don't trust a station that greets you in your phone before you've asked for anything. Don't break the shared story with your passenger. Don't let one of you go inside while the other waits out of sight. If the trucks face outward, pass. If you see the same price board pattern twice in a night, pass. If the restrooms are open, but the hallway feels longer than the building, pass. If you hear your own engine in the silence like it's too loud for the world you're in, pass. I stood there reading it in daylight, and my first impulse was relief, and my second was anger. Relief because it matched everything we'd stumbled through. Anger because it meant this had been going on long enough for people to write a field manual on a vending machine. The normal part of my brain wanted an explanation that would shrink this into something manageable, some combination of fatigue, anxiety, urban legends traveling faster than truth. The other part of me, the part that had watched an exit get edited out of my mirror, knew that even if the explanation was rational, the pattern still acted like a predator. Whatever its origin, it had learned the rhythm of human need. It had learned how to sit inside the reasonable. I took a photo of the list and then deleted it. That might sound stupid, but it felt right. Like the rules weren't meant to be collected like trophies. They were meant to be carried in the quiet muscle of your behavior. The moment you turn them into a souvenir, you risk turning the pattern into a hobby. And a hobby is a door you open yourself. I got back into my car and drove home, and the rest of the day went the way days are supposed to go. Messages, noise, errands, the slow, boring proof that reality is sturdy when enough people are awake to hold it together. I slept that night without the sensation of headlights carving a tunnel through living dark. I didn't dream of gas station lights or looping signs. I didn't wake up with my hands clenched around a steering wheel that wasn't there. I almost convinced myself the whole thing was a chain of coincidences strung together by a mind that had spent too many hours staring into empty asphalt, almost. Then, a few days later, I ran into an old co-worker who does delivery routes between towns. We weren't close, just friendly enough to nod in hallways and complain about deadlines. He asked offhand if I still drove those late stretches. I shrugged and said not as much. He nodded like that answer had weight, and he told me, casually, that he's stopped taking certain stops on his route because he doesn't like how they feel. I asked what he meant. He looked at me with a tired smile and said he couldn't explain it without sounding crazy, but there are places where the lights feel like bait and places where the lights feel like mercy. He said he only stops where he can hear ordinary human annoyance, where someone behind the counter looks bored instead of watchful. He said he always takes a passenger if he has to go far, even if the passenger is just a friend who wants a free ride. And then he said the one line that sealed the whole thing shut in my chest. The problem isn't the dark, It's the quiet agreement you make with it when you think you're alone. After that, I didn't need more proof. I didn't want it. The pattern didn't have to announce itself again for me to respect the shape of it. Because the truth is, whether it's something supernatural wearing infrastructure or something psychological that spreads through tired travelers like a shared fever, the result is the same out there on the road when the world is thin. You either keep your reality connected to another person's, or you risk being the kind of driver who steps into a bright, quiet lot and never quite steps back out in the same version of himself. So here's where I end this. Not with a screaming reveal or a monster stepping into our headlights, but with something more honest to how these nights actually settle into you. I've decided that if I ever have to take those long drives again, I won't do them the old way. I won't chase the most convenient stop. I won't trust the slishcom clean light or the too polite silence. I won't split the story with the person beside me. I'll keep the car moving until we find the loud, ordinary places, the messy places, the places that don't feel like they're trying to persuade us of anything. And if the gauge dips low, I'll treat that discomfort like a small tax for staying out of whatever invisible spiral some lots seem to draw into the asphalt. Because maybe that's the real ending in stories like ours. You don't defeat the pattern. You learn its tactics. You stop giving it the kinds of choices it feeds on. You refuse the neat, tempting logic that tries to turn your tiredness into consent. You keep your friend beside you, listening, breathing, existing in the same stubborn frame of the world. And you get home not victorious, not enlightened, just intact. And if one day I call you again and ask if you want to ride shotgun on a long drive you don't really need to take, you'll know it isn't because I'm lonely or because I want company for the sake of it. You'll know it's because on certain roads, the safest thing you can bring with you isn't a full tank or a map or a lucky charm. It's a second person who helps the world stay real simply by being there, by holding the seat down with quiet certainty while I keep talking us through the dark.